joining us today for the 6th episode of the Resistance Bureau, a program that spotlights issues surrounding democracy and the struggle for freedom in Africa. But today we'll have a special look at the United States. I am your host, Mandata Mlojo, and joining me today is my colleague, Jeffrey Smith. And also we're going to have Professor Chisman, who's going to moderate our public Q&A session. Also remember that you can send us questions during the program to +263 776 238 199. So the number on the screen, +263 776 238 199. You can send us your your questions through WhatsApp to any of the speakers or generally to all of the speakers. You can also follow the discussion online via Twitter. Just look for @ResistBureau and make sure to use the hashtag ResistBureauLive. Right now, we are also streaming on Facebook Live and YouTube, and this show will be recorded for later distribution.
Thank you so much, Mentade, and thank you so much for joining us from the bullpen at the very last minute to fill in for our colleague, Farida. We hope everything is well with her. And thanks to the many viewers worldwide who have joined us today for this timely and very important discussion, one that is near and dear to my heart personally. To be blunt, American democracy is under threat. From day one of his presidency, Donald Trump, conjuring a theme of American carnage, has exhibited many disturbing trademarks of authoritarian leaders throughout history. Over the past 3+ years, he and his administration have violated the spirit and in some cases the letter of the United States Constitution. He has stoked political polarization and racial tensions. He has referred to the media as enemies of the people, and he has derided critical analysis of his administration and its policies as fake news. He has also politicized the rule of law and has publicly called for the jailing of his political opponents. In doing so, Trump has emboldened dictators worldwide who share a similar disdain for the free press, human rights, and civil liberties. Now, as American citizens gear up for a general election in about a week's time, one in which Trump has refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, the administration is actively undermining public confidence in the electoral system by casting doubt on the integrity of the vote. This is truly unprecedented. What is more, Trump's repeated endorsements and approval of the use of force against peaceful demonstrators has encouraged political violence and echoes statements that have stoked serious political conflict in countries as varied as Bangladesh, Kenya, as Patrick Gathara, one of our guests, knows very well, and in Guinea most recently. This is not a theoretical exercise. It is happening in real time before our very eyes. In its June 3 atrocity alert, for example, which highlights situations where populations are at risk of or are enduring mass atrocity crimes, the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect included the United States alongside Iraq and Syria as places of serious concern to watch. If the election is close and disputed next week, as seems almost inevitable, there is a real risk of conflict and potentially a constitutional crisis. This episode will assess these mounting threats and more and determine what lessons and expertise that Africans, those with us today, can share with Americans about how to effectively defend democracy, ensure the rule of law, and promote needed national healing.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I'm very excited to be hosting the show with you. But more than that, joining us today to talk about these issues is an amazing group of speakers. We have on the show Dr. Sithembile Mbete, who is a widely respected and often quoted political scientist who has developed a reputation as one of the most insightful commentators on South African affairs and international politics. She's now a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Mbete previously served the presidency of South Africa, where she put her knowledge into action as a researcher in the Secretariat of the National Planning Commission. We also have on the show Patrick Gathara from Kenya. He's one of Africa's most famous satirists and political commentators. He's equally known for his brilliant satirical cartoons as he is for his analysis and PV for social media commentary. Having cut his teeth in his native Kenya, where he was instrumental in the creation of alternative news site, The Elephant, he has contributed analysis on international affairs to highly respected publications around the world, including the Washington Post and Al Jazeera. We also have finally Omoyele Sowore, who's a groundbreaking human rights activist from Nigeria, pro-democracy campaigner and the founder of the popular online news agency, Sahara Reporters, which promotes citizen journalism in Africa. Despite what has been happening, despite having been arrested by the Nigerian State Security Service on trumped-up charges of treason, he has continued to fight for justice and has recently played an integral role in the End SARS campaign against police brutality in Nigeria, which has garnered international attention. I'm very excited to have these amazing speakers today, so I'll just jump straight into it. So Sowore, I would like to come to you first because we can't go on without really talking about the shocking events that have been unfolding in your native Nigeria, ones that have somehow captured the world's attention, like Nigeria and the United States. Police and security forces are no longer seen or respected as guarantors of the rule of law. Instead, they are more believed to be a threat to public safety. How has this scenario played out in Nigeria, and what has been the consequences?
Well, for the first time, let me thank you guys for bringing me on your program. This is very interesting. This is very interesting times for not just Nigeria but the African continent. I think somebody commented on Twitter today that Nigeria has become a motivation for resistance on the continent of Africa. So what is happening in Nigeria now is reverberating in Kenya, is reverberating in Guinea, and I'm sure it will get to Togo and also Ivory Coast pretty soon. So I'm glad to be here. That's what is going on in Nigeria right now. We're in the midst of what used to be a protest last week or 2 weeks ago. Now it has become an uprising, and what could potentially lead to a revolution. Should warn the rest of the world and prepare their minds for it, because the movement is a movement that started with a few people, including myself, on October 8th, and before you know it, had spread across the entire 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory in Nigeria. Following that, it has spread across the world. I'm hearing for the first time today that a Formula One driver, one of the best, is involved, in solidarity with Nigerians. And I think what has happened is that Nigerians have risen up for the first time in a long time that I know of in unison, and jettison what used to be our fault lines, particularly religion and ethnicity that these guys in government used to divide us, and they're fighting back against the oppression. They've been driven against the wall, and they have decided to fight back. And as we speak, a lot of cities are still in this uprising, and those who were attacked last week are recovering and are planning to go back to the barricades. But there is some specific information you need. It was that, as it is typical of African dictators or despots, soldiers have always been part of the people who prop up dictators in Nigeria. The Nigerian army were deployed on the 20th of October to go and shoot up peaceful protesters at a toll gate where they've been gathering peacefully. After the governor of Lagos, which is Nigeria's largest city, probably Africa's most populous city, said there was a curfew. But we told those of us who motivate these young people and also participate, we told the young people who are involved that a curfew does not affect your fight for freedom. And as a result, a curfew doesn't even ask you not to protest. It only says don't leave where you are. So stay where you are. And by 6:45 p.m., they went and shut up the protest. And as we speak, they've been trying to cover it up. Some people, first they said the soldiers were not there. Secondly, they said they were there, but they don't know who invited them. And now they're using all kinds of methods to claim that there were no casualties, even though we have now found out where the soldiers came from, mostly who led them, but there's still an attempt to cover it up. But the world has already caught up on this, largely because of social media and the kind of global village that now exists. And as I've said all the time, African dictators, African rulers, some of them I refer to as dinosaurs from places like Uganda, Guinea, Ivory Coast, should know that their time is up. There's nothing they can do about it, because the moment Nigeria gets it right, they're in trouble. And the people who are about to get it right in Nigeria are young people who have no love for ideas that have expired. A lot of these African dictators and despots, including our own president here, President Muhammad Buhari, who we largely refer to as an effigy. I call his presidency a parishioner presidency. You just go and see him on the wall. It doesn't really exist. They are on their back heels. And we have to ensure that there's an African-wide solidarity to keep pushing this narrative and pushing the movement and motivating them until Africa is liberated from Algeria to South Africa. That's what we need so that we can integrate Africa as our forebears have planned. And the Europeans stole that idea while they were saying it was a bad idea for Africans to unite under Nkrumah. They were quietly developing a European Union. They were developing a United States of America. They were developing their own unity while they were devastating and destroying our capability to unite as a people. So that's what I have to report from Nigeria, and I'll be glad to take more questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Sowore. So one thing that I took away from what you just gave as the context in Nigeria is the idea that this started off as a protest in the streets where people are saying there is need for an end to police brutality. Then you talk about how it then advances, escalates into an uprising and potentially a revolution as you're looking at it. But now thinking about your analysis of the situation in Nigeria, what, if anything, do you think can be done to ease the tensions that are apparent in America as citizens there gear up for the election on November 3?
Well, let me tell you this, which is interesting. The Nigerian authorities chose this very auspicious time of US elections to strike, thinking that some of our solidarity support in the US would not be paying attention to Nigeria. That was why they did what they did. The atrocity they committed on October 20th was largely because they thought elections in the US is so gripping that nobody will pay attention to any atrocities committed in Nigeria. But as you can imagine, Nigerians are more interested, I tell you, in US elections than probably they're more interested in their local elections, because we know that whatever happens in the US will affect Nigeria, will affect Africa. In fact, there's the belief that if the US election goes the way of one particular candidate, the one that we all know, it will embolden the dictators in Nigeria because he's their hero. But if it goes the other way, it is expected. Let me be too optimistic now, because sometimes I can't even find a difference between these Democrats and Republicans in the US. They're like twin brothers and sisters on so many issues. But it's expected that, we will turn the corner. We will get the kind of solidarity and support and foreign policy engineering that can give us some kind of breathing space to deal with our own. We are not asking for, the Marines to come and save us here. We don't need the African command to come and take over power here. We're just saying, look, don't look away when there are violations of human rights. Don't, prop up African dictators, which is something that's happened over the years. You all know about the Cold War. You know about how so many of these African leaders, good ones, were killed, sometimes directly by some of the agencies of US security services. But we just need a new world order that allows young people to deal with their own internal colonizers. And I hope people in the US also have understood that just as we need a revolution in Nigeria, they need a revolution in their own political system as well, so that they too can get the needed liberation, hopefully after November. We are all in this together,
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Mbete and Sowore. That was really illuminating. But I think this is a really great moment, perhaps, to bring in Dr. Mbete here. In countries like South Africa, for instance, where the apartheid regime explicitly sought to exacerbate racial divisions, a truth, justice, and reconciliation program, as we all know, sought to promote healing and identify needed reforms in the country. So given the problems we've just been hearing about, what important lessons do you think, in your expertise, could a potential Joe Biden administration that Sowore was just speaking to, how can they learn about how to move America forwards in a positive way, perhaps deriving lessons from the South African experience?
Thanks so much for your question, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here on this panel. I think that the big lesson from South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Later commissions in other countries have been Truth and Justice Commissions, which I think is an indication of some of what was missing from South Africa's TRC. And I think that the big lesson from the TRC is that it must not be seen as an end point, but rather the starting point of an ongoing process. And I think one of the mistakes that was made in South Africa is that the TRC was seen as this end in and of itself, where people who'd committed atrocities told the truth in exchange for amnesty, and with the hope that there would be then a process of reconciliation that would be born naturally from that process. And what we're seeing in South Africa now is that that isn't the case. Indeed, the TRC itself, in their final report, recommended a number of more direct redress measures, and like having a wealth tax, for example, a once-off wealth tax, acknowledging that white South Africans had been able to make a great deal of wealth during the time of apartheid and the period of segregation and colonialism before then, that Black people were not able to, so that your white population was starting from a different base altogether. And basically that you needed some kind of reparations. That was never taken up by the government. And I think a lot of the inequality that we still see, and a lot of the tension, the racial tension and the resentment that we still see, is a direct result of not dealing properly with the reparations issue. Secondly, people who did not come to the TRC to reveal what they knew, then weren't eligible for amnesty, and those people should have been prosecuted in, whether it's a Nuremberg style prosecution or anything else. And that also has not happened. So there's a lot of unfinished business from the TRC. So I think that the lesson for the US from the South African case is that having a process of transitional justice like that is valuable, but it mustn't be seen as the end point. It must be seen as the starting point for fundamental reparations and socioeconomic policies that are going to actively work to level the playing field. And I think that that's the process actually that the US needs to be embarking on, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter protests this year. And what we've seen, I mean, one of the most remarkable things for me about the US election and watching now as people start to vote is that you can literally 10-hour-long queues of people waiting to vote in predominantly African-American, Latinx, and minority communities. That's voter suppression live. And so until you deal with all of those fundamental structural issues, I don't think that the US can just put a Band-Aid on the Trump era and hope that things are going to get better.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mbete. And I think one of the things that I'm really taking away from it is the idea that there is need to view a lot of those things as processes, not just a once-off event that's supposed to bring about certain results. And I think the biggest question that I have that we can potentially reflect and not necessarily respond to now is, does the layman or the ordinary citizen understand the process element, and who is responsible to actually bring them to an understanding so that they too can be a part of the process? So Sowore, I'd like to jump back to you for a minute as well. I think I'd love to explore the linkage between the US and Nigeria a little bit more. So there is much that has been written about Trump's literal embrace of the world's most notorious dictators. Some argue that there's authoritarian instincts embolden human rights abusers abroad. So in November 2018, for example, the Nigerian military tweeted a message that used Trump's comments about shooting immigrants at the US border as justification for their own shooting and killing of the Shiite Muslim protesters, an event that reportedly left 50 people dead. So the question really is, have leaders in Nigeria and elsewhere taken the cues from Trump? And what has this meant for democracy around the world?
President Donald Trump is a blessing to dictators around the world. It's a blessing to despots. And I don't think he hid it. stroll to North Korea with pride, and the North Korean dictator is well known to not just only kill people, he kills with the kind of weapons that we're talking about that was deployed on the 20th of October. To kill, we heard it, how he killed his uncle, if those sins are correct, how he sent assassins to kill his brother, I think in, was it Thailand or Malaysia? I'm not sure which of the countries now. So that's the kind of thing that dictators love, to have the person that they typically should have been afraid of, or a country that typically used to be a moral police, be part of their gang. So it's like he's creating a global system of gangsters, and then they see his swag. They call it swag. Yeah, even in this, they love him. In fact, Trump has got now black supporters. There are a lot of supporters in Nigeria who support Trump. There were some churches yesterday that were doing a rally for Trump, while their colleagues and brothers and sisters were fighting against police brutality, because he has been able to sell the bogey to the Nigerian far-right Christian community that he's also fighting for Jesus, or he's a Jesus person. And I've listened to Trump quote the Bible before. He doesn't even know, in my view, the difference between the New and the Old Testament. So, but they believe him. They believe him. He's doing an amazing job of riling all these right-wing people, whether they're black or white or Latino or yellow. He's doing a great job at that. And that is why the world must stand still on November 3rd, and just watch, and we are going to be helping you count the votes so that we don't have a repeat of those hanging shots out of Florida. We have to help you count and make sure that the votes are properly counted. If you guys disappoint us, then we are seceding from you guys. The world will secede from you guys. That's it. You just have to be on your own. You have to be on an island for the next 4 years. Nobody coming to the US. Nobody's leaving the US. I am not coming back if Trump wins in the next 4 years. And I've lived in the US for 20 years. But here is it. It could also be that, this would be a wake-up call for US citizens. I found something very disturbing in the 2016 election, that you would meet people who say we don't like Trump, and then when they go into the polling booths, they voted for him. So it was kind of weird. And that's why these days I'm not very carried away with polls when they say, this person's going to win. Because you never know. He's got like secret admirers. He's got secret admirers and supporters in the US, but he's got open admirers and supporters across the world, people who are mostly dictators. As you rightly mentioned, Mbete, Nigerian government loves to draw parallels between their own shootings and killings and whatever is happening in the US. Even when this whole NSAS thing started, all their trolls on the internet, on Twitter in particular, they'll be telling you, oh yes, some policemen just kill people in the US. So what's the big deal? We killed a few here, no big deal. But they know all the statistics of all the police departments in the US who are killing black people. And they use it as a way of winning argument or shutting you down, or trying to troll and heckle people who are opposed to police brutality. But guess what? We were also part of the Black Lives Matter from this part of the world, not because of Black Lives Matter as a movement alone. That movement was targeted at Donald Trump. It's a global way of saying, look, we're tired of him. And again, I have to say, the question goes back to you on this continent, in your country, the United States of America. Are you tired of Trump? We'll find out on November 3rd.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's very profound what you've had to say, and I think I'd like to continue sort of pulling apart that thread that you've been expertly unraveling. And Patrick, I think perhaps it's a good point to pivot to you here, because you personally have written very eloquently and spoken very eloquently about what you've called the dangers of hubris, particularly in the context of the United States and Americans. Until recently, obviously, the US under both Democratic and Republican administrations, going back generations, has positioned itself as the paragon of democracy and by extension of global democracy promotion, flaws and all. Have we perhaps, as Sowore has argued, been blinded to our own inherent and perhaps mounting flaws? And would you agree that the US is in need of a wake-up call?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, for sure. I think the US problems didn't start with Trump. I think it would be a real grave mistake to simply think that it all started in 2016 and all we need is get rid of Trump and everything becomes fine. It's been happening for a long time. And it goes all the way back through Democratic and Republican presidents. You can think about, for example, the accumulation of power within the presidency. This has been a centuries-long process, that has now had the president essentially, what Trump is saying about the lack of accountability, is something that has been built over time. And I think some of the discussions that the US has been encouraging other people to have, other countries to have, for example, within Kenya, about accountability, about transparency, about the need to have a real way of tethering public officials. It seems to me that the US did not have this discussion itself, and that's why I talk about hubris, is when you think you are the shining light on top of the hill, you're the one who is showing everyone else the way, perhaps it makes you unaware of your own faults. And I think that the US did not look internally. It's not just the US, you can think about the West in general, what's happening, for example, in the UK. It kind of mirrors this. So that they need to be asking the same questions. I once went to, in about 2016, I think I was in Canada, 2016 or 2017. I was in Canada for a conference. And some Americans were speaking to what's going on with Trump, etc. And for me, it was, I was wondering, why is American civil society? In Kenya, we've got an expectation that there are civil society groups that will stand up and push against certain things. And at the time, we weren't seeing it. I think right now you've seen an explosion of it. But again, it's the point that you need to create these systems. You need to nurture them and bring them up, and you need to have ways of standing against the abuse of power. And to think of it as a systemic thing, as a long-term fight that you're going to have, not one that's going to be fixed by one election. It doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Biden who comes in. The problem is systemic. You've got to fix the system itself, not simply think of replacing people one with another. And since the theme of this is about lessons from Africa, I can give you the lessons from Kenya about this, where the idea has been propagated that all we need to do is to vote in good guys into power, and it keeps being sort of put back to the populace. And I think we've even seen it here. Sort of, it's your fault for voting in the wrong people. It's Americans' fault for voting in Trump. They get the government they deserve. But actually, it's not. In the end, it's the fault of the system that you have. That means that whoever you put in will one day act pretty badly towards you. In Kenya, we have replaced dictator after dictator. We've had four, and always the next guy is supposed to be the good one, but it never really works out that way. In 2002, which is the only credible election perhaps that we've had, presidential election, we pretty much replaced the entirety of government with our civil society and opposition people who for years had been saying things, people who had integrity, they had suffered for the stance that they had taken on behalf of the people. And yet almost overnight they changed, because the incentives that were built into the system we put them in simply meant that they were going to turn. And I think that's a thing to think about, the US should think about, is yes, get rid of Trump. But if the person who comes in has the same incentives, the same power that Trump enjoys, then you run the risk that he will simply behave the same way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight, Patrick. And I think, I could sit here and talk about this particular topic all day. But I think in terms of the breadth of the issues we wanted to cover today, I want to pivot slightly and ask you a follow-up question, because I know you've had some direct experience with this in Kenya, and that's namely the divisive use of social media and the partisan attacks on all forms of media, which we have seen on the rise here in the US. Unfortunately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, given the way this conversation has unfolded and the events that many people listening today have been following, often these attacks come from the US presidential podium itself. But as you know, the same phenomenon has been evident in Kenya, particularly around election time, unsurprisingly. And we know that in Kenya, following post-election violence in 2007, a program of peace journalism training was introduced to encourage professionals to think about the consequences of their statements. Some critics have said that this led to censorship and was actually bad for democracy. So there seems to be a really fine line here. What do you think, in your experience and in your expertise, is the best way to deter hate speech and incitement without actually harming freedom of speech and other key civil liberties here in the United States as we all gear up for the election next week?
Well, I think two things. First, we've got to think about the values that we put in. So, for example, free speech, is it an absolute value? I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that it is. It's there to achieve a particular goal. And I think that there are instances where it does make sense to limit speech. But again, who does this limiting? If you say the state is the one that decides what speech is going to be allowable or not, then you will run into problems where people will tend to censor speech that is critical of them. In Kenya, we've seen this. So when we have, for example, our hate speech legislation, it's really used by government to go after people who criticize it, and they'll talk of hate speech against the president or hate speech against the government, which is a nonsensical notion. But that's what they will use to go after their critics. So you've got to be careful, again, to devise systems that where if you do want to put limitations, and I think that there is a good case for saying that it should not be absolute, to think around how do you, who does the limiting and who decides what's allowable and what isn't. When it comes to the media itself, I think, in Kenya in 2007, there was a lot of criticism put out against the press that they had been part of the mechanism of inciting violence after the 2007 election. So we had about 1,000 people killed in the early part of 2008 in that election, in that violence. And the media really got a lot of criticism for this. And the reaction to that was what you just mentioned, was this development of this idea of peace journalism, where when people think about what they report and the consequences it will have, and that, I think, came to bite us in 2013 when we had the next election. And people went sort of the other extreme, where reporting problems in the election was seen as incitement, so that the big aim of media was not to explain what was going wrong, was not to explain what was actually happening, but was to foster peace. And I think that when you put that burden on media, then you run into a whole host of problems. So in our case, election that was clearly problematic was being praised, across the globe as a peaceful election, and there was a real push to kind of dampen down any criticism of it, or any suggestion that the election was being stolen because everybody was afraid that if we raise these issues, then somehow people are going to go and grab their machetes. So I think we need to be a bit more careful about that. I think there was an improvement from the Kenyan media to pull away from that in the last election in 2017, but I don't think they've gotten the balance quite right. You're right, it is a fine line, but it is one that I think bears people thinking about and deciding, beforehand, before you actually get into the crux of the election, to start working on what does it look like, to model it out and to think through it. In the case of the US, you're already there, and I think there's a lot of work to be done within US media, especially the sort of partisanship or hyper-partisanship that seems be the case now. But to think about, in the time after the election, what do you want to build? What sort of media do you want to have? And if you can define that and have discussions around that, and early enough start putting in place the systems that you need, then you'll be more prepared or better prepared for the next election. Which for me that would be the test of whether or not you are actually putting in the changes that you want.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was very extensive, but very also informative. But then there's two things that I'm taking away from what you just shared with us. The first question around the idea that there is need to actually restrict speech, because at the end of the day, we need to govern. But the biggest question coming in to say, who limits that speech? And I think it comes back to the kind of leadership we have. Do we have leadership that is responsible and accountable enough to execute those kind of policies that can govern speech? But also looking at, do we have confidence in the leadership that we have, not just here in Africa, but also looking at the United States as well. But also,
if I may very quickly just jump in there. Yeah. It's not really, I don't like the sort of talk of it's about leadership. I think in Africa and in Kenya, we've been told for a very long time that our problem is bad leadership. All we need to do is have the good guys in. And I think that's what is actually wrong, because it blinds us to the systems. It's to think about what are the systems that you want? What do you want? What's the outcome you have? And to understand that behavior is modeled by the systems. It is influenced, is incentivized by the system. So if people have, for example, Trump, if he had a truly accountable system that he was dealing with, he wouldn't be doing most of what he's doing. But it's because the system allows it and he knows he can get away with it, that he behaves the way he does. In Kenya, we have systems that incentivize people to go out and steal because they know there's not going to be a price to do it. So you get a politician in tomorrow, he's a multi-billionaire, and because of that, he knows he's going to have even more access to more resources. So until you actually forget about getting in nice leaders, to actually think about how do we get systems that can contain bad leaders. I think for me, that would be the real test or the real reform that you should be looking for.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think, Patrick, I think it also takes me back to the second thing that I was going to mention as something that I took away from your presentation, to say between the person and the system, what really is at fault? And also coming back to the idea of Trump as president of the USA right now and say, what does he reflect about the weaknesses in the system in place right now? And what avenues for change need to actually be explored? It comes back to the idea of the leadership in place and them being able to expose some of the weaknesses that are there. But jumping back to Dr. Mbete, as a noted expert on elections in one of Africa's strongest democracies, I would love to hear your thoughts here. For example, it seems that for very basic components of election management, those that are seen as essential for credible elections worldwide are actually absent in the US. There is not a national or non-partisan election commission, for example. What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the US system, and what needs to be done to improve it?
Look, I think that when you think about the US democracy, you need to accept that that the founding fathers expected the US electorate to always be white men. And everything around the US electoral system since then has been designed and shaped and reshaped to protect the interests of white men. And so the very fact that states have so much autonomy, have complete autonomy, actually not even so much, have complete autonomy over the management of elections, over the funding of elections, and that you have this diversity of electoral rules in the United States and processes even around, do you have photo ID, do you use photo ID when you go vote or don't you? The fact that there is no uniform voters roll, that rules can be different from county to county. And there is no national election body that oversees the management of elections at a federal level. And the protection of state rights, the enshrining of states' rights in the way that we see in the US system is a product of the Civil War, of trying to appease the losers of the Civil War, that they weren't going to lose their rights as white men in the United States. And so everything from the way in which Senate seats are distributed to the way in which the Electoral College is set up means that the US doesn't have a properly democratic system in the way in which US organizations design democracy for Africans. So when any of the American organizations come to Africa to, advise on setting up democracy, you have an independent electoral commission, you have an audited voters roll, you have a set of uniform regulations around everything from the number of observers that there are at a polling station, to the opening hours of polling stations, to the kind of paper that you print the election on. I mean, the ballot on. There are all sorts of rules and codification that are seen as being important for a good election. Issues around the simplicity of the election, so that it must be easily translatable to the people who has won. And the US electoral system has none of those. Not a single one of those electoral components exists in the United States. And yet, year after year, election after election, the American elections have been considered credible because the Americans say they are. You know what Patrick says about hubris, right? Is that America's a democracy because America says it's a democracy, so we all believe America's a democracy, so no one sends election observers to the United States. And I think that this particular moment with Donald Trump, and that he's broken the rules of what an American president should say, shouldn't say, how they should posture. And he has acted explicitly, crudely, as the kind of leader that the US system creates. And that's now shocked people. But the point is that there is nothing stopping another Donald Trump from emerging. And there is nothing stopping Donald Trump, if he wins a second term, which he very well may do, from having him dismantle the system, even from having actually using the system that exists to dismantle whatever other protections still exist in the United States. Just a final thing, I think that for African states, so much of the corruption, Donald Trump is a corrupt, kleptocratic leader. If the definition of corruption is the use of public power for personal gain, that's Trump. But and I think that what the US is seeing is the consequence of how much money has been allowed to drive American politics. And so all of these decisions by the Supreme Court and whoever else that have allowed people to buy candidates, basically, and to buy policy, to buy media, leads you to a leader like Donald Trump. And for many African countries have lived through that because of neocolonialism, that our leaders get bought by Western companies, Western governments, and even if they had run and campaigned on a particular thing, once they are in power, they can be bought. And that's exactly what the United States system is. Politicians in the US are bought even before they're in power by the money within the system. And until you deal with that issue, Donald Trump is the beginning of a trend. He's not, or is the most crude version of what has been set into US politics, I think, for a long. And he's not the crudest that is going to be in the United States. America can see worse if something isn't done.
So given some of the evident problems with the US system that you've just identified, and some that have been identified earlier by some of the other speakers, how should the international community respond? Do you think that if Trump refuses to leave power and in turn violates all democratic norms, should global leaders speak out on the situation? And is it even possible to hold a country to account, especially one that is as wealthy and as powerful as the USA?
And so the problem, joys of the hubris again, is that the post-World War II world order is based on the United States being stable, being democratic, and being rich. Our institutions, our multilateral institutions, don't know how to handle a United States with post-election violence. They don't know how to handle a United States that can't self-correct. And often self-correction is oppression, right? So in the civil rights movement, you didn't, and yes, the context was different in terms of the Cold War, but the idea that the US could contain the Blacks who were protesting, even though that process of containment was itself undemocratic, was enough because it maintained the stability of the system. The challenge is that the United Nations Security Council, NATO, don't have the frameworks to deal with a United States in a domestic security crisis. And so I'm not entirely sure, and of course with the US having a veto at the Security Council, it'll be immensely difficult to do the same kind of Security Council presidential statement or Security Council resolution that got done for Kenya in 2007. So I think that this raises very important questions about how completely flawed the structure of our international system actually is. But I think that there's probably a lot that needs to be done by the US's traditional allies, the United Kingdom, France, the EU in general, to have some mechanisms of trying to mediate in whatever the conflict is that comes afterwards. But I do think we're entering uncharted territory, that the international system is not built for a collapse in the United States. The international system would United Kingdom or France, because they were collapsed in 1945, than it can a United States. So it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those really insightful remarks. I have so many follow-up questions, but what I'm going to do now is turn the keys over to my esteemed colleague, Professor Nick Cheeseman, for our Q&A session. Nick and I have both written and talked extensively on these issues as well, including a few co-authored articles. So this one hits particularly close. So Nick, as someone who has literally spent their life researching democracy and authoritarianism worldwide, I know the audience would surely be interested to know what your own work and your own research has to say about these issues we've all been discussing today. So quickly, in your estimation, where is the U.S. potentially headed, and what warning signs should we be looking out for? And thereafter, let's have you check in to see what questions we have from our audience for the panel, because I know we've received quite a bit.
Thanks, and thanks everyone. I mean, I think the panel's been spot on. I think Dr. Mbete's point about, let's not mince words here. We're not going to Africa to learn lessons to America because America might have a conflict and Africa's had some conflict, so it can speak on conflict. We're going to Africa because actually there's elections in Africa that are better run than the US election. If you went to Ghana right now and talked to the Ghanaian Electoral Commission about the idea that you don't have a central electoral authority, you don't have one set of rules for registering the vote, you don't have one set of rules for casting your vote, and you don't have one set of rules for announcing the vote, they would be appalled and amazed. So actually we're not going to Africa because, of conflict resolution strategies. We go to Africa because actually, as Dr. Mbete said very well, many African elections are actually better run than this US election is going to be. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we're dealing with the kind of hubris that we've been talking about as well. I think from my point of view, I really worry about where the US is right now. And I'll put my cards on the table. It's dangerous to make predictions, but I think some kind of violent political incident is more likely than not, given where we are right now in the United States. I think that's how dangerous it is. And I say that because if I was being asked by somebody to talk about the risk of violence in a country, I would be looking for 5 or 6 key indicators. I'd be looking for weak institutions that don't have trust. I think we tick that box in the US. I'd be looking for historical ingrained grievances that have been exacerbated recently. I think we tick that box. I'd be worried about an armed population with a high level of guns and weapons in society. I think we tick that box. We'd be looking at irresponsible populist leaders who are deliberately attempting to undermine confidence in the polls and may well not accept the result. And we tick that box. And the 5th point would be, I'd be looking for a closely contested election that could easily have a sort of result that flips at the last minute. Trump wins the ballot box on the day, but loses in a landslide in the postal votes because Republicans are going to turn up in person and Democrats are more likely to postal vote. That's very similar in a way to what happened in Kenya in 2007-8. Including that timing, including that last minute switch. So I really do worry about where the US is right now. And I think we tick every single box when it comes to worries. Especially when it comes to the way in which law enforcement in the US has itself been called into question through Black Lives Matter and whether or not they have authority to police urban spaces. So what I'd like to ask the panel is, and this comes from a question we've got from an American who's watching today in the US, is some of the things we've been talking about today are long term. There are things like social media over 1 or 2 elections. There are things like Truth and Reconciliation and Justice Commission, which are all well and good. But what the American who's talking to us today wants to know from Denver is, how do we actually stop this election turning into a crisis now, given that it's happening on November the 3rd? Is there anything that actually can be done short term that we have any experience of on the panel to resolve that situation? So that's one question we have. The second question we have is actually a Nigeria question explicitly on NSAS, and I think it's also a really good question. So the question is basically, it's been really inspiring to see the NSAS movement. It's been inspiring to see so many young Nigerians coming together and sustaining the protests for so long. But there have been protests in the past around fuel price increases and so on, and they haven't always led to transformation of the broader political system. So the question from a viewer who's watching today from Nigeria is, what does NSAS need to do to actually be able to affect that broader transformation of the political system rather than just being a single issue protest that goes away in time? So I think 2 really good questions there. How do we actually respond to what's happening in America by November the 3rd? And how does NSAS become something that's sustainable and really leads to broader change? Maybe, Sowore, we could start with you on the Nigeria question, and then we could come to the other 2 panelists to talk about the response to America.
Thank you so much. Let me say something about America before I talk about NSAS. And it's, you guys talk about democracy as an innovation it's a Western innovation. But like every innovation, I think democracy has gone through 3 stages in the US and is due for complete overhaul. The first stage is the innovative stages where you have like great guys talking about democracy works, representative, and then you have imitators who came and made it look like great. You have the JFKs of this world, the Bill Clintons of this world, and then your democracy is on the 3rd stage. It's got to be borne down by an idiot, and And I think that's the stage where you are. And the first idiot to come towards US democracy, in my view, was George Bush. But somehow you guys managed your way out of that crisis. And, you brought in Obama, who came and, kind of put things together, just hold it together. He didn't really do much, but he kept it together because otherwise the fault lines are too open. Like we say in Nigeria, your nyash was open. Everybody was saying your ass. And then you brought another idiot, and if you're not careful, it's going to burn down your democracy. And it's going to burn down the concept of democracy completely around the world. Because there was a study about 3 days ago that I saw, I think it was in The Guardian, some newspaper in the UK, saying that people are having less and less belief in democracy, especially outside of the US, because of the way democracy is being operated in the US. So if people don't believe in democracy anymore, it's because you guys brought some of your idiots to burn down the innovation of democracy. And you should be ready to deal with the consequences, because someone else has to bring out another innovation. And it may not come from the US this time, because the way I'm looking at it, if we're not careful, the African Union might be sending election observers to the US to help you guys out. You're so lucky that Mugabe is dead. He probably would have sent a bunch of election observers to observe this election. But even if the world is not coming to observe your elections, they're watching to see what will happen. And it will just be uhuru for the rest of the world if you burn down the last vestiges of a democratic tenets, which is one of it is election, it's credible election in this coming election. Then you have no reason, and nobody will have any right to tell anybody to be following democratic tenets anymore. As we call it here in Nigeria, democracy is as good as its operators. We don't have democracy in Nigeria, we have morontocrats, morons running our democratic system. So we call it a morontocracy, and I think the US is close to that. The last thing I would say, which is about EndSARS, I have been fighting seriously to not make it a one-issue demonstration or uprising. I'm opposed to any attempt to make it one issue. In fact, it's an insult to the insurrection that's happening in Nigeria today, or the uprising, to say that it's all about police brutality. The police brutality or EndSARS is just the hashtag and the alias name for pent-up anger that over these years have become a burden on the young people. And they've been looking for a way out. They've been looking for something that would be a spark. So police brutality or EndSARS or SARS was just the spark. It's just like what happened in Tunisia. It was the guy whose wares were thrown away or burnt, and then he set himself ablaze, self-immolation, and it caused the problem or the revolution in Tunisia in those days that led to the uprising, the Arab Spring, as they call it, the so-called. It's the same thing with EndSARS. In fact, just to surprise you, the guy who was reportedly killed by SARS that led to this uprising did not die. He's alive. In fact, he was not even shot, according to information. It happened somewhere in Delta State. They ran after him. He fell into the ditch somewhere, hit his head, and people just saw blood and said SARS again. Nobody is asking about him anymore. Nobody wants to know whether he died or survived. It's just like, we've had it. It's enough. And then everybody went out. As we speak now, it's gone to a different level. In Nigeria, they called yesterday National Palliative Day, because the palliative, the support that was supposed to go to the people as a result of COVID-19, were stolen and kept in warehouses by state governors. And people are going in there to liberate these palliatives, bags of rice, indomie, whatever you call it, whatever they could find. In fact, some guys went and stole, I won't say still, they went and liberated this, and when they couldn't find anything to take, he took the city sign of one of the cities up north and took it home. He's going to melt it into something, maybe a pot, who knows? Some guys went and took the sign of the state assembly in the Kitty state. They want to take it home and melt it into something. See, people don't understand. It's not about SARS. And I've been fighting, even the guys who are making it about SARS and SARS, we've been having some kind of internal disagreement, because we're saying to them, this is the time for revolution. Don't let us miss it. But to answer your question directly, it is sustained. You see, the government has a problem with the NSAS movement because it doesn't have leaders. And the reason it didn't have leaders is because the government has tried to create all kinds of leaders for it. It didn't work. They went and brought celebrities, they brought some individuals, they brought billionaires. They had all kinds of meetings, it didn't work. Because we need to sustain this until it becomes a revolutionary moment. Like I said, there are 3 stages to it. There's a protest and then an uprising and a full-blown revolution. And if Nigerians can just be a little bit resilient, we're getting there because, this system is not sustainable. It got to collapse. If it doesn't collapse, they will come back even stronger and more ferocious, more vicious against those who are protesting today. I'll say one last thing. The people that were shot at in Lekki, they're the most peaceful part of the protesters. They're like middle class people, celebrities. It had speakers blaring over the place. They had food available. It was like a social, networking event over there. But yet, the Nigerian visual state did not spare them when it was time to shoot down people. So position is that, hey, it's NSAS. That is the signboard for it. That's a sign. Let's make it a revolution. Let it happen, and you guys can be proud of us. And if we do it successfully, we will be bringing you guys from the US to come and learn how to have a revolution in case you don't have it on November 12th.
Thank you. That's a great way in which to end your answer. I think the other point, just to flag, that people have missed perhaps in some of the coverage recently, is that a number of states in America have actually banned international observers. So it's not just the case that America is sending observers to observe elections abroad when its own elections need serious attention, but there's actually a ban in some states on foreign observers coming in. And I think that really does suggest a really problematic double standard that we do need to deal with. It goes back to the hubris point. But it also perhaps makes you wonder about what some of these states have to hide and what they might be worried about international observers saying about the practices that they see on the ground. With that, I'd like to go to our other 2 panelists and to take us back to the US. Is there anything you think that can be done by November the 3rd? Are we too close, or are there things that have been done in other countries that might help in the case of the US? Dr. Mbete, why don't we go to you first, and then Patrick Gathara will go to you afterwards.
Okay, look, it is immensely difficult to do anything between now and the election day other than encourage people to go out and vote. And I think other than encourage, particularly for Democrats, need to try get as many of their people out to vote in person as possible in order to limit the situation that Prof. Cheeseman was talking about, where the in-person votes will come in first, and the in-person tallies will come in first, and it'll look like Trump is winning, and then that swings when ballots are counted. So when mail-in ballots are counted. So I think that trying to get as many people out to vote in person is going to be incredibly important between now and election day. The problem that the United States has, which is also wild to me as an African democracy scholar, is that the judicial system is so deeply politicized. So usually what you would advise for people to do is that get up a big civil society response and organize, mobilize civil society to be able to hold the election bodies accountable with the count and with the announcement. And then if that does not work, litigate. The thing in the United States is that you're going to have a Supreme Court that's completely jam-packed of Republican sympathetic judges. And the processes to litigation are going to be difficult, considering that the Electoral College only meets to vote on the 14th or the 16th of December. So the process between the in-person votes and the Electoral College votes is so long, and there's so many processes that need to be met first, that when exactly you go litigate and how you do so is then incredibly difficult. So I think the best chance that the United States people have is to mobilize civil society in order to get international attention. There's going to need to be a lot of pressure put by American civil society on the world to act, and to use whatever power there is to try and override the United States veto, for example, in the Security Council or whatever else. And so that's my best advice.
And I think the point you make there about the Supreme Court is a really important one, that this isn't just a crisis for Trump and it isn't just a crisis for the elections. If this case ends up going before the Supreme Court, and let's not forget that an election not that far away did in the US, if this does go before the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court is seen to make a flawed judgment for Trump as a result of having been selected, so many judges recently being selected by Trump, this will become a constitutional crisis for the Supreme Court as well. And that will then suck different parts of the US political system into this in a way that actually could be much more fundamental for the broader political system. And we've seen in countries like Kenya, even where perhaps many of us felt that the Supreme Court judgment was brave and correct, that actually courts can become incredibly politicized during elections, and that can really undermine their ability to have authority over the country in general terms. So I think that point you make there about the Supreme Court is a really good one. President, let's come to you last. Are there any things that you can think of by November the 3rd? It is a big ask, and it is important to note that in some states, I think in Texas, over 60% of the voters have already cast their ballots. So in some sense, this is an election that has already happened as much as about to come. But is there anything by November the 3rd that could be done to reduce some of the risks that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, I have to say this looks very familiar to me from the standpoint of Kenya. Everything you've said, for example, about the Supreme Court is the same thing we had. I mean, if you remember the 2007 election, one of the reasons why there was a violence, that's not the only reason, or the major reason, but one of it is because the opposition simply wouldn't go to court. They didn't trust that the legal system was free or could freely determine the election, And I suppose you could say the same thing with the decision that was made in 2013, by the Supreme Court, and also the decision on the second election in 2017, So you're very right that these cases do end up diminishing, I think, the value of the Supreme Court. I think even in the case of the US in 2000, there was quite a lot of talk that it was basically something to just let Bush get through, or get the country to endure the election rather than a full determination of whether or not he had won the election. Anyway, my point from the Kenyan perspective, I think, would be that to think about what the goals and aims are. I think it's simply calling for people to turn out. That's about the election and about the outcome of the election. But you've got to distinguish that with the need for people to, number one, either accept a verdict when it comes through, whether or not it's what they want. But also, what are the limitations when it comes to protesting a verdict that you think is unfair? And I think Kenya faced the same thing in the last election. I think there are certain rules that you need to get people to accept. And even at this last stage, you can start mobilizing, for example, civil society to push for. First is, I think, a fundamental acceptance that violence is not a way to resolve this, and I think that's a statement that needs to be made. You need to be able to get people to accept, even if we do not agree with the election, in the means that we choose to go about challenging the outcome, that violence is not going to be one of them. I think that's going to be a message that's put out very quickly and very clearly. I think the point about having pressure from external sources, both from the international community, I think is really important. But I think for me, it would be pressure on the actors within the US. So who are the people who are more likely to cause problems, to incite violence, and to see whether you can bring, you can create pressure points on them to dissuade them from doing this. In the case of Kenya in 2017, I think the potential for people to be prosecuted in the same way the president had been in 2013, was a bit of a barrier on this problem, on potential troublemakers. So we've got to think about what are the pressure points we can put on people like Trump and others, whether it's on either side, to actually ensure that they behave in ways that don't exacerbate the situation. One final thing, I think, is to think about what happens in the period in between the vote and the determination of the outcome. There are very many things that are going to be happening, from litigation to deciding who the electors are when they turn up, who they're going to be voted for. There's going to be many issues about which votes count, etc. So how do you maintain peace through that, throughout that period? How do you get people to say, we can wait, let's not declare victory? In fact, this is where you bring in, I think you need to have a discussion with your media people. Who gets to call the election? What happens if Fox News on November 3 stands up and says, we're calling it for Trump, and everybody else says we're calling it for Biden? What's going to happen then? And I think if you have a discussion with the media people about having a basic agreement about the rules, how they're going to go about this, then I think you can put some way towards mitigating the potential for having a violent reaction to whether results are delayed or announced on November 3rd.
Thank you very much. I think those are really good answers. I think, and as good answers I think we can get in this tough situation. I think that final point about the media is really important. I was recently talking to an editor of a US newspaper who said that their media consortium had agreed that they will not declare the result. Now, they will just report the results as they come in. But as I said to them, the problem is if you responsible guys don't say anything, you're actually just leaving more space for Fox. Right? So it only works if everybody agrees that no one is going to release the result early. But if all the responsible people, if CNN and all the others sign up to not saying anything, and Fox still does, and the more right-wing media still do, then of course the problem that you've identified is still there. So it's really about getting that consensus. But I think the final thing I'd just like to say before I send us back to Jeff and Mantali to wrap up, because we're sadly out of time, is that I think everything we've said suggests that at a sort of broader international level, what we need to see going forwards is less of a kind of emphasis on US democracy promotion abroad and more of an emphasis on let's have a global conversation about renewing democracy everywhere, including in the US, in which everyone has a seat at the table, everyone can speak from their experiences, and the US, and I will add as a Brit, I will add the UK, and other countries can add in and talk about their problems of racism, their problems of elections, their problems. In the UK, we have an unelected body. We have massive problems of disparities between constituencies in terms of how many people get to elect MPs. All of these issues should be put on the table so that it's a genuine conversation and a partnership about how to revive democracy everywhere, rather than certain countries assuming that because of their past, they can lecture other countries around the world about what needs to be done. And I think if we can move in that direction, it would not just be a much better conversation, but it would be a much more egalitarian, equitable conversation that I think people in Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world would find much more respectful and productive. So hopefully one of the things that might come out of this is a little bit more humility from a Biden administration and a greater willingness to engage in that kind of conversation. Although I think Patrick's point that this is not something that began with Trump is also really important to keep in mind. With that, fantastic Q&A. Thank you very much. And over to Jeff.
May I just very quickly?
Of course.
I think the nature of democracy also is something that we'll need to discuss in the global conversation that you're suggesting, because I think we've gone away from the idea that democracy is about people ruling themselves to the idea that it is about picking people to rule us, which I think is a subtle but really fundamental point. that people are not participating so much as simply picking other guys to go and do things for them. And I think we need to sit back and ask about the place of elections in democracy. We've tended to, I think, overemphasize elections, and to put so much stock in an election to the detriment of other ways of holding public officials to account. And I think that if we can de-escalate elections, if we can de-emphasize them and promote more participation by ordinary people in how they're ruled, I think that can be a good way of ensuring that we don't end up in situations where elections are seen as sort of fights to the death, if you will.
I think that's a good point. And when Alexis de Tocqueville went to the US and wrote Democracy in America in 1830s, one of the things he thought would save American democracy from the potential of the kind of tyranny of the majority was people making decisions for themselves about their lives at a relatively small scale local level, and taking that and the kind of Republican idea of self-mastery and democracy as being constantly engaged. And we've moved a long way away from that, right? Both in the way we internationally promote democracy and also in the way that the US is, as you and others have talked about. That centralization of power was something that wasn't really envisaged originally. So I think you're right, that getting back to that idea of actually engaging people in making decisions about their communities and giving them the power and confidence to do that is a fundamental part of reimagining democracy for the next generation. And with that, Jeff and Mbete, we hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick, for facilitating that excellent and engaging session. And thank you so much to our listeners for taking the time to join us today. And thank you most especially to our brilliant panel. I can say with certainty, and I think we all agree that we learned quite a lot today. On a personal note, the continued response to the Resistance Bureau has been tremendous, and we remain appreciative and humbled by the support. We have plans to maintain this platform, and moving forward, we have some really great shows, so you should be on the lookout for that. In the meantime, don't hesitate to follow up with us on our website, www.theresistantbureau.com, and by subscribing to our newsletter there. After each episode, including today, we compile an extensive reading list that enables you to actually learn more about some of those topics that we're discussing. And more than anything, we encourage you to also stay up to date by visiting our social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. As a final note, this show would not be the success that it is if it wasn't for the team that brings it to life all the time. And thank you so much to our advisory council members, of which I'm a proud member, for always being on call to offer their insights and advice as we put together shows. And a special shout out as well to our colleague, Peter Dory, who's always behind the scenes. But more than anything, we wouldn't have these shows if it wasn't for your expertise. And to JJ Medina, who created our recent visuals that we're really honored to roll out and hope you will check out on our social media platforms. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you next time as the Resistance Bureau. Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.